These bacteria that live in and on our body are there to do things that we as humans can't do. It's a true symbiotic relationship. 85% of the nitrate and nitrite we get from our diet comes from plants and vegetables. Only 5% comes from cured and processed meats. The other 10% comes from swallowing our own saliva from the nitrite and nitrate that are naturally produced in the human body. The people who practice a plant-based diet have lower incidence of cancers. Sure, you can replete and restore estrogen or testosterone or hormones, but first let's focus on restoring the enzymatic production of nitric oxide, because if you restore the hormones without restoring the enzymatic function of nitric oxide, you're not going to restore the cardioprotective benefits of hormone replacement therapy.
For the people who are listening and they don't really understand nitric oxide, which, by the way, from someone who comes from a medical background, it was even hard for me to really understand all the different mechanisms of action. Why don't you explain to us what nitric oxide is?
Yeah, well, first, thanks. It's great to be with you. Yeah, nitric oxide is now recognized as one of the most important molecules produced in the body of humans, in fact, all mammals. But at the end of the day, it's a signaling molecule, right? It's how cells in the body communicate with one another. It's primarily known as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. That's how it was first discovered, and really Nobel Prize was awarded for its role as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. But it dilates blood vessels and improves blood flow to every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. In the brain, it's critically important because it's part of our neurotransmission. It's produced by the neurons, and it's a retrograde messenger, so it controls a lot of neurotransmission, things like, calcitonin, gene-related peptide, glutamate, all the signaling is part of nociception and pain sensitization, long-term memory potentiation. But it's also part of our innate immune system. It's how our immune cells kill bacteria, prevent virus from replicating, and preventing us from getting sick from many pathogens.
So it's a gas.
It is a gas, and that's what makes this really a unique signaling molecule. And I think that's what the Nobel Assembly basically why it was awarded a Nobel Prize, because the signal transduction by a gas is a completely new paradigm in signal transduction as we knew it prior to the discovery of nitric oxide. The other challenge in recapitulating nitric oxide signaling and production is how can you harness the therapeutic benefits of a gas that's naturally produced in the human body, but then once it's produced, it's gone in less than a second. So it's this fleeting molecule. Once it's produced, it activates these second messenger systems, but it has a half-life of less than 1 second.
No.
Yeah, whether it's produced in the lining of the blood vessels, where it's produced in the immune cells, or even in neurons.
So nitric oxide is a gas, if you will, but it's something that allows for vasodilation. That is for our arteries, our veins to dilate in order to increase perfusion or blood flow.
That's right.
So it's a naturally occurring. So we're all born with it because we need it, evidently. And what is your hypothesis then? Because you've spent your entire
25 years
25 years understanding what nitric oxide is. So I guess there's more to it than what you just said. If you spent 25 years on it.
No, look, now we have a clear understanding of nitric oxide. Once in the 90s, nitric oxide was considered this miracle molecule because it seemed to do so much, and miracles are things that happen but have no explanation. So today, it's not miraculous because we understand its production, we understand its signaling, and all its biological activities are very well elucidated in terms of mechanism. So it's not a miraculous molecule. It's not a miracle molecule. It does some miraculous things, but I wouldn't consider it a miracle.
So it was a miracle because we didn't understand X amount of years ago what dilated the blood vessels?
Well, miracle meaning that miracle kind of in the broad term are things that you observe but really have no explanation for how it happens or why it happens, right? And so how could this gas that's naturally produced affect things like blood pressure, sexual function, cognition, exercise performance, inflammation, oxidative stress? How can a single molecule mitigate and regulate all those seemingly fundamental biological processes? So it was almost like a miracle. People call it, well, it's a miracle. It just does it. We know it does it. We don't know how it does it. But now fast forward, 25, 30 years, we have a clear understanding of how it's produced, what its cellular targets are, how it activates cellular second messenger systems, and how it controls vasodilation, how it reduces inflammation, how it prevents oxidative stress, and how it mitigates immune dysfunction that we see in every chronic disease.
I really want to get into that because I want to understand how it's produced because, correct me if I'm wrong, we is it like with everything in aging? Do we lose our ability to produce nitric oxide, or do we just have do we just lose nitric oxide as we get older? Like, what's the correlation between nitric oxide and aging?
Well, if you look at population-based studies, and this was done back in the 90s, the older we get, the less we made. So similar to growth hormones, similar to hormones, right? But it doesn't have to be the case. So now we understand. So the basis for my research program when I was in academia was, let's first understand, how does the human body make nitric oxide? What leads to this age-related loss of nitric oxide production? What symptoms manifest? What disease manifests as a result of that? And then once we understood all that, then and only then could we start developing product technology, drug therapies, nutritional products that could restore the production of this molecule.
So you keep producing it then. It's not just a natural, there's not just like you don't have just a storage sink of it. You produce it.
You naturally produce it. I mean, that's the production of nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessels is what's responsible for the second-to-second regulation of blood flow. So, if I'm trying to recall where I left my keys, we have to increase blood flow to certain regions of the brain for memory recall. If we're about to exercise, we've got to increase blood flow to the heart. If we're about to have sex, we got to increase blood flow to the sex organs. And so nitric oxide is what leads to the vasodilation, memory recall, sports performance, sexual function. So we need that second-to-second production of nitric oxide. And if you can't produce that, then you lose the regulation of blood flow. You develop sexual dysfunction, high blood pressure, Alzheimer's, dementia. You become immunocompromised. So this laundry list of symptoms that manifest all can kind of trace back to this functional loss of nitric oxide production.
Okay, so then what is the cause of not being able to produce nitric oxide?
Well, today we recognize there's two pathways where the human body makes nitric oxide. There's an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase, and that enzyme is what's found in the neurons. It's what's found in the lining of the blood vessels and our endothelial cells, and it's an enzyme that's expressed and induced by our immune cells.
Interesting, because we were just talking offline about the correlation of NOS, that's nitric oxide synthase, and neurodegenerative diseases such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and even Alzheimer's.
Yeah, dementia and Alzheimer's.
Dementia. Can we just focus on this one for a second?
Yeah. So there's a vascular component to every chronic disease. And so if you go back and look at the work of Dr. Daniel Amen, who does SPECT scans of the brain.
Correct.
I think the largest database of SPECT scans in the world.
By the way, a highly controversial topic, if you will, because I don't see a SPECT scan in a hospital setting.
No, and I think I was just with Dr. Amen last week, and he's famously quoted as that psychiatrists are the only physicians that don't look at the organ they're treating.
Correct.
Cardiologists certainly look at the heart, either through echo or through angiogram. GI docs take a look at the gut. They do a stool analysis. And so,
neurologists are looking at MRIs and CTs.
Yeah, so how can you treat a neurological disease or a brain without looking at its function? Not only its structure, but its function. And so SPECT scans actually allow us to look inside the brain, and really what it's telling us is how well perfused that organ is.
So how much blood flow?
How much blood flow is getting into certain regions of the brain, because obviously certain regions of the brain have certain functions. And if there's what we call focal ischemia or lack of blood flow to certain regions of the brain, then neurological disease manifests. Because if you can't, think about it. If you're not getting oxygen and nutrients and blood supply to an organ, that organ fails.
Correct.
And the best example is in ischemic heart disease. If you've got an obstruction of the coronary arteries and you can't get blood supply to the heart, you develop ischemia, angina, heart failure, and people have heart attack and die. So same thing happens in the brain. If we don't have adequate blood supply to the brain, then the neurons don't get the nutrients, the oxygen they need to do their job. And what is that? It's signal transduction. It's neurotransmission.
Yes, and something that I've stated many times on this podcast is that the brain is the most vascular rich organ in the body. And what we know from, studies even in hypertension, we know that the first thing to go are the little capillaries.
Yeah, microvascular dysfunction.
Those tiny little one-cell blood vessels that supply different areas of the brain blood. But I'm still not understanding where, and we'll probably get into atherosclerosis as well, where NOS fits in to even the small blood vessels of the brain, where things go wrong, because we don't hear, especially in my world, in Alzheimer's disease, we don't technically hear, we hear maybe a blockage or an infarct. Okay, you see stroke, but we don't go so far to hear about nitric oxide dysfunction.
That's right.
Okay.
That's why we're here. We're hoping to change that, right?
Yes, please educate me on what it means when you have, so we've got the first component, which is NOS. What happens when this goes wrong? It just, it occludes the blood vessel?
Yes, so we have to first understand the enzymology and the biochemistry of that enzyme.
Yes.
So there's a known biochemical reaction whereby this enzyme takes an amino acid, L-arginine, and then converts that into nitric oxide gas. And then you get citrulline as a byproduct. So this is a very complex biochemical reaction requiring, it's a 5-electron oxidation. Many cofactors, many substrates, everything has to be present at the right time in the right place for that enzyme to make nitric oxide gas.
Okay.
The rate-limiting step in that entire biochemical reaction is oxidation of a critical cofactor called tetrahydrobiopterin, or BH4 short. So when BH4 becomes oxidized, then NOS uncouples, and now that enzyme actually produces superoxide instead of nitric oxide.
Okay.
So we have to prevent BH4 oxidation.
Yes.
And then we can maintain NOS coupling, and typically we can maintain normal nitric oxide production.
It's so funny. I think you were just listing the ingredients of a pre-workout.
That's right. We've been doing this for many years. And so, again, we understand what it takes to make nitric oxide, to recouple the NOS enzyme, and to maintain normal nitric oxide production. Because really what we're finding is if we can prevent the age-related loss of nitric oxide production, you can completely prevent age-related disease. Cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, metabolic dysfunction.
Is that irrespective of plaque in the arteries?
Well, nitric oxide is what controls and regulates plaque deposition.
No.
Yeah, so when the endothelial cells produce nitric oxide, it prevents the upregulation of adhesion molecules, prevents lipid transport, prevents the hyperplasia in the smooth muscle, prevents stenosis of the coronary arteries, and maintains normal coronary flow. And without adequate nitric oxide production, you get an upregulation of adhesion molecules, monocytes, neutrophils stick, platelets start to aggregate, you get lipid transport, you get fat deposition, plaque instability, plaque rupture, and that's a heart attack or stroke.
I wonder how this would play out, and I don't know if you know, in genetic mutations. And actually, I always differentiate in Alzheimer's disease with the ApoE4 gene.
Right.
We want to understand there's risk genes and then there's the mutations. So we've got the amyloid precursor protein and presenilin 1, presenilin 2. But if we look at carriers of the ApoE4 gene, have you seen any correlations between NOS and ApoE4?
Well, as you said, these are risk factors or kind of predispositions for disease. But the genetics is kind of like your blueprint. It doesn't necessarily mean that it predisposes you, but we can't blame disease on genetics anymore unless you're born with an inborn air metabolism, right? So we can overcome that. So obviously, if there's single nucleotide polymorphisms in the nitric oxide synthase gene or an methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, the MTHFR, and it's that enzyme that reduces biopterin to tetrahydrobiopterin. But obviously, if you have an ApoE polymorphism or you've overexpressed that, then there's clear data showing that you have an increased kind of predisposition for development of Alzheimer's. But again, genetics doesn't always translate to function.
Correct.
So what we're finding is that if we can maintain normal nitric oxide production, no matter what the risk factors are, it basically gets to the root cause of Alzheimer's. And what is it? It's lack of blood flow, it's focal ischemia, and it's insulin resistance. So when you develop insulin resistance, you can't get glucose into the cell. That's the primary fuel for the cells of the brain use. If you're not getting adequate blood supply there, then you can't get the oxygen nutrients you need to that part of the brain to function.
Correct.
So you don't get the good stuff in. You don't take out the metabolic waste products. It leads to protein misfolding, buildup of tau proteins, buildup of amyloid plaque. And that's what we describe as Alzheimer's. But if we can maintain nitric oxide production, maintain adequate perfusion, increase glucose uptake, potentiate insulin signaling. Now the brain can signal, it gets the oxygen, it gets the nutrients it needs. There's no protein misfolding, and can you maintain normal cognition?
Well, seems pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Did you, I don't know if you saw the latest FDA approval of lecanemab or Leqembi.
Yeah, no, I saw. I don't watch TV, but I did see it on my feed or something. But monoclonal antibodies, I think, are they're chasing the wrong target.
Yes.
I mean, and plus, the amyloid plaque and the tau tangles aren't the cause of Alzheimer's.
No, they're the symptom.
They're a consequence.
Or the consequence, I shouldn't say the
consequence of
symptom.
the underlying
I retract
problem.
that, yes.
So if you're going after the consequence of disease, do you think it's really going to have, anybody with any objective readout, is it going to affect the onset and progression of the disease? And then we're finding that a lot of these monoclonal antibodies, you have imaging artifacts that
Brain
they
bleeds.
may look better on imaging, but there's no improvement in cognition or the prognosis from disease.
Actually, we're actually seeing atrophy from Leqembi and brain bleeds. And it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, well, they just pulled one drug off the market.
Yeah, they did. Because we're still going down that amyloid cascade hypothesis. It's funny, we can get to the moon, but we still can't figure out Alzheimer's disease, which just is really unacceptable to me, to be honest.
Well, we're getting there. We have a major effort for our Alzheimer's drug program. We're developing a nitric oxide drug specifically for Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's patients or mild cognitive impairment patients?
Well, the devil's in the detail. When you do drug studies, the success or failure of any drug is, number one, is how you design the clinical study and what patients do you enroll in it. So I'm working with Dr. David Perlmutter on designing a trial because here's what we want to show. Worst case scenario, we want to slow progression. So we have to enroll patients early enough in the process to where we can see if we're slowing the progression. Best case scenario, we want to reverse disease, because the basic science around nitric oxide shows that we can actually reverse disease. So we want to catch patients early enough in the disease process where we can monitor their progression, but we also want to catch patients far enough along in the disease process and symptoms and kind of the underlying pathology that we can show in our drug study we can actually regress disease and reverse disease.
Huge. The word reverse and regress when it comes to this disease.
And more importantly, prevention. Once we get
prevent, yes,
an understanding, and we have a clear understanding of the mechanism of action of nitric oxide and the onset progression of every major chronic disease, including Alzheimer's. Once we understand that and we get a drug approved for the treatment, then I think what we'll do is we'll develop strategies, rational therapies and strategies that we can recognize nitric oxide deficiency early in the process before the onset of symptoms, such as ED, such as high blood pressure, such as mild cognitive disorders, which leads to vascular dementia and then eventually Alzheimer's. So you take these at-risk patients and then you intervene early on. And now you have a prevention program. Because we all know it's much easier to prevent disease than it is to treat it.
Oh, 100%. So you're, back. I know this is still step one. We've got to get, because you mentioned that there was 2 steps.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get there soon, guys. But really funny that you said ED, erectile dysfunction, and it would be hard. Correct me if I'm wrong. You said the half-life is less than a second. How could you even detect dysfunction or deficiency of nitric oxide if the half-life is less than a second? This episode is sponsored by Momentous Supplements. You may assume that you're getting everything your body needs from your diet or a simple green juice, but I recently discovered that most people, including myself, are still short on essential nutrients our body needs to function at our best. So I have been taking Momentous Creatine, omega-3 and protein daily to ensure that all of my bases are covered. If you follow me on Instagram, you know that I am a huge proponent of 5 grams a day of creatine and 2 grams of EPA and 2 grams of DHA daily. And according to my body weight, I am doing 110 grams of protein per day. Now, supplements can feel like a dirty word, and navigating the space can be daunting due to the lack of trust and transparency. But I've come to learn that I can trust Momentous. This is why I'm actually an advisor to the company. And Momentous makes the decision so much easier for me because my trust in the products are very, very high due to their dedication to working with the best, from their collaboration with experts to their unparalleled commitment to only using the highest quality ingredients possible. And also, they have invested heavily in their third-party testing. So there's a reason why the world's best athletes and experts use and help develop Momentous products. So if you're like me and you want to take supplements that are made by and used by the best in the world, go to livemomentous.com and use code NEURO to get 32% off your first subscription order. If you don't feel like subscribing, you can still use my code to get 20% off all of my favorite products. That is livemomentous.com with code NEURO.
Huge challenge clinically, because in the research lab, we can do this. We can draw peripheral blood, we can test saliva, we can test the tissue biopsies, and we can quantify. And so we don't really quantify nitric oxide, but we've created a fingerprint of nanobiology. So once nitric oxide is produced, we know where it goes, what it becomes, and what it does. So in the research environment, we can do that. We can quantify what we call an NO metabolome. And then we can look at different disease processes and figure out, what's going wrong with nitric oxide production, nitric oxide signaling. Clinically, it's not like your cholesterol or vitamin D where you just go and you draw blood and they send you back a number.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist for NO because it's a gas. So we have to rely on symptoms, right? So if you start to develop sexual dysfunction, that's really the first sign and symptom of nitric oxide deficiency.
And in men, that is?
It's men and women.
Okay.
Because to get an erection in men or women, we have to have vasodilation to get engorgement, to increase blood flow. And that comes from the blood vessels in the sex organs producing nitric oxide. So if you have vascular dysfunction in the sex organs, you can't produce nitric oxide, you get no dilation, then that's erectile dysfunction. And it's also part of the orgasm process. So for in women to have an orgasm, you got to get an increase in intralabial, intraclitoral pressures, and that comes from an increase in blood flow. That blood flow comes from nitric oxide. So if you have vascular dysfunction, you can't make nitric oxide, no dilation, no increased engorgement, no increase in pressure, and women become anorgasmic.
It's it actually reminds me of a cream that are generally given to postmenopausal women to help with that process, and it is a vasodilator. I'm not sure what's in it, other than there's some estrogen and some other things. Yeah, interesting. Okay, but then how does that explain why erectile dysfunction rates are actually rising?
Well, if you think of so then the next part of our kind of research program was, we know how the body makes nitric oxide. Now, what disrupts it?
Yes.
And so this answers many questions. Why is there an increase?
Okay.
20-year-old kids with erectile dysfunction.
Yes. What is what is erectile dysfunction classified as?
Obviously, it's a disease diagnosis, but there's treatment for it, right? The PD5 inhibitors, the drugs like the Viagra, the Cialis, and Levitras, which act downstream of nitric oxide, they don't affect nitric oxide production. But it's vascular dysfunction. But it's really a systemic disease. It manifests as erectile dysfunction. But if you can't dilate the blood vessels of the sex organs, that same disease occurs in the brain and the heart and the liver. So you have systemic vascular dysfunction.
Yes.
It just manifests as the inability to dilate the blood vessels at the proper time when we're stimulated, when we want to have sexual activity. And if you don't vasodilate, you don't get engorgement, and you can't get an erection. So it's really the canary in the coal mine. And it's the first sign and symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. And if you treat it as a lifestyle disorder and not treat it as a root cause of cardiovascular disease, then you're doing that patient a disservice. So we have to look at it now as really a systemic disease, and it's more than a lifestyle disorder or socially inconvenient symptom.
Yeah.
It's a sign of systemic disease.
It's funny that you said systemic, because I teach I teach neuroscience and neurology, and when I'm talking about the blood vessels in the brain that supply the anterior part of the brain, we know that we've just got branching out of the aorta. We've got the carotid arteries, then we've got the vertebral arteries, but we don't usually tend to think of branching off into the entire system, right? So I think that's a really important point to follow through with. And Viagra was also wasn't that first known as a cardiovascular disease drug?
Yeah, Pfizer was developing it originally as for pulmonary hypertension to dilate the pulmonary arteries, but it was a vasodilator.
Yeah.
And so in these clinical trials, the men self-reported back that when they took this drug in the clinical trial, they experience these great erections. And, the economics obviously lead drug development from these big pharmaceutical companies. So they basically abandoned, ischemic heart disease protocol for PD5 inhibitors and even pulmonary hypertension and went for an erectile dysfunction. And I think it was a wise choice because it was a huge unmet need at the time. But, these drugs were approved in 1998. 26 years later, 50% of the men don't respond to these drug therapies. Wow. They don't respond with better erections. And now that we understand the mechanism of action of how these drugs work downstream of nitric oxide production. So if the body can't make nitric oxide, it doesn't activate these second messenger systems, so these drugs cannot work. And that explains why there's 50% non-responders to PD5 inhibition therapy. They're completely devoid of nitric oxide deficiency.
Yeah, so it's basically you're just putting a Band-Aid on it, really, which is the entire U.S. healthcare system, by the way.
You're not addressing the root cause of the disorder. Yes. Because now we're finding, so nitric oxide kind of turns this switch on, and that's Viagra keeps it on. So nitric oxide leads to increase in cyclic GMP, which is a second messenger, and PD5 inhibitors prevent the breakdown of the second messenger. That's why you're warned against 4-hour erections, unsafe drop in blood pressure, because it's not isolated to your pelvic region. It's systemic. It's still dilating blood vessels of the brain. That's why you get a horrible headache, because it leads to an increase in cerebral or cranial pressures, and it can be dangerous. And cause seizures, causes changes in vision, an unsafe drop in blood pressure. Some men get priapism, which leads to, that's an extended, like a 4-hour erection, which people wonder, well, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is you run out of oxygen, and the outflow is constricted. So then this tissue is being deprived of oxygen for 4 hours. It leads to necrosis, and you've got a dead organ.
Yeah, that's quite scary.
It's
for all the men out there who wants a 4-hour erection.
Yeah.
I wonder if this plays into this famous study that I read, which was really life-changing for me. Basically, Ben Levine, he's a cardiologist, a sports cardiologist, where he showed that evidently as we age, we get stiffening of the arteries in the heart, as we know. And then we also get left ventricular hypertrophy. So we know that the left ventricle supplies the muscles with blood, and we know that the right ventricle supplies the lungs. And what he found was that he took 53 50-year-olds and subjected them to, I think, 3 to 4 hours of maximal aerobic exercise per week. And over the course of 2 years, he reversed some of the age-related symptoms of the stiffening of the arteries, and he saw that these 50-year-old hearts actually turned into 30-year-old hearts. So he was able to open up the left ventricle, allowing for more blood flow. And I wonder where nitric oxide would play into that.
Well, exercise is medicine because it stimulates and activates nitric oxide production. And the problem in the American lifestyle is nobody exercises anymore. Right? We live a sedentary life. We get in our car, we drive to our office, we sit, nobody sweats, nobody exercises, and we're sedentary. Plus the food we eat, the diets that most Americans practice, all lead to a decrease in nitric oxide production.
Okay, so you said then you now know that that's really important. Okay, so we can actually increase the synthesis of nitric oxide through exercise.
That's right. It's just moderate physical. I mean, it's not. You don't have to do a lot. I mean, years ago it was demonstrated that 20 to 30 minutes of just moderate physical exercise a day, because that when you start to exercise, that causes a little bit of shear stress in the lining of the blood vessels, right? Because you increase your heart rate, it pumps more blood, and it causes shear stress that activates nitric oxide production. And if your endothelial cells can produce nitric oxide, dilates the blood vessels, increases perfusion, and actually increases meets the increased demands on the heart. So you can dilate the coronary arteries, and now your heart works better. It regulates blood pressure. The left ventricular hypertrophy and the arterial stiffening leads to high blood pressure. Then when your heart's pumping against high blood pressure, it has to create more muscle to pump against that higher pressure. That's not healthy. Over time, it leads to heart failure and heart disease. So if you can increase an exercise regimen, improve an exercise regimen, improve your nitric oxide production, you dilate the blood vessels, so you lower the pressure. Your heart has to work less to deliver that blood, and it mobilizes stem cells. So now you can completely remodel the heart
Yes.
and reverse the left ventricular hypertrophy, mobilize stem cells, replace and repair dysfunctional cells, and restore the function of the heart. But all that is dependent upon the body's ability to produce nitric oxide.
Okay. We have reached the stage where we really need to understand what is limiting our, or unless you want to go to stage 2, step 2.
Well, let's talk about the second pathway, because really that really leads into how diet and lifestyle are completely leading to a nitric oxide deficiency. And what I believe and what the science corroborates is that it's what leads to chronic disease. So it's probably been 30 years ago, there was first studies showing that the oral bacteria are involved in the production of nitric oxide that regulates blood pressure, that monitors, that mitigates inflammation. So now that the microbiome project has been completely mapped, right, with a clear understanding of the bacteria that live on our skin, in certain body parts, the vaginal microbiome, the oral microbiome, the gut microbiome, these bacteria that live in and on our body are there to do things that we as humans can't do. So it's a true symbiotic relationship, right? The human host is providing them kind of a way to deliver metabolic products that provide the human host benefit. So when we destroy the microbiome, that has health consequences, right? Okay. So it's clear today that people who use antibiotics, overuse antibiotics, complete gut dysbiosis, systemic disease. What people failed to realize, so probably 20 years ago, we started interrogating the oral microbiome, because for me, this is where digestion first occurs. It's really the first way that we start to break down the foods we eat and provide some metabolic function. Obviously, we were interested in nitric oxide. How are the bacteria in the mouth responsible for producing nitric oxide? And does this have systemic effects? Because this was a completely new paradigm in nitric oxide-based signaling. Because the enzyme, there's a co-localization or a proximity of the smooth muscle to the endothelial cells. Nitric oxide is produced, it's a gas, it diffuses in the smooth muscle, activates guanylyl cyclase, vasodilation, increase in blood flow. But nitric oxide being produced in the mouth, how is that affecting nitric oxide and vasodilation in the systemic circulation? I mean, completely foreign type thought process. But what we were finding was if you gave people mouthwash, these were people who had normal blood pressure, and the only intervention was we gave them mouthwash to completely destroy the microbiome, and then we saw an increase in blood pressure. So then it's like, well, and this was very reproducible.
What was the increase?
I mean, in some cases, in a paper we published in 2019, we could see after 1 week of mouthwash, we could increase systolic blood pressure by 26 millimeters of mercury.
You're joking.
Yeah, so we would take normal, healthy 21-year-old kids and giving them mouthwash twice a day for 7 days, we made them clinically hypertensive.
Oh my God.
This completely changes the world of cardiology and management of blood pressure.
So basically you're saying if mothers are giving their kids mouthwash, they are subjecting them to hypertension.
Absolutely. And 2 out of 3 Americans in the U.S. have an unsafe increase in blood pressure. And not coincidentally, 2 out of 3 Americans are waking up every morning and use mouthwash.
And it's funny because the U.S. medical system will just prescribe you an ACE inhibitor to deal with that.
Right. Well, that gets into this whole concept of resistant hypertension.
Yes.
Right. So if you have high blood pressure, you go to your doctor, he puts you on an ACE inhibitor, angiotensin receptor blocker, calcium channel antagonist, a diuretic, or some docs use beta blockers as a first-line therapy for hypertension, which to me is malpractice. But yet we know that 50% of the people that are prescribed antihypertensive medication don't respond with better blood pressure. So they're refractory to the increase in blood pressure. So why is that? And in our 2019 paper, we argued that their hypertension is a symptom of oral dysbiosis.
Just oral dysbiosis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not a renin-angiotensin issue. It's not a kidney problem. So ACE inhibitors, ARBs, obviously aren't going to lower their blood pressure. It's not a dysregulation of calcium flux or metabolism. So calcium channel antagonists aren't going to normalize their blood pressure. It's not a fluid imbalance. So it's not a volume overload. But what we're finding is that they're destroying the oral microbiome, killing the bacteria in their mouth that are normally responsible for producing nitric oxide. And so now we find, okay, if you have resistant hypertension, you ask people, are you using mouthwash?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have fluoride in your toothpaste, which is an antiseptic?
Well,
Then-
doesn't all toothpaste have fluoride in it?
Yeah, and we wonder why we're sick. So think about this. Fluoride is an antiseptic. That's why they put it in toothpaste to kill the bacteria. That's why they put it in municipal water to kill the bacteria in the water
Correct.
supply. It's a neurotoxin, and it shuts down your thyroid function. And we've got an epidemic of hypothyroidism all around
Yes.
the world, especially in the U.S.
Yeah.
So we focused on strictly what are we doing that's destroying the oral microbiome, that's leading to a disruption in nitric oxide production, that's leading to the onset and progression of all metabolic disease, including cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, you name it.
So let's just say you've been having mouthwash, you're washing your teeth with fluoride-rich toothpaste. We want to start introducing the good bacteria back into our mouth. What are we doing? Are we having probiotics?
Well, unfortunately, there's no probiotic or prebiotic on the market that restores the bacteria. But here's really the fascinating thing. And we've been studying the human body for many years, and I'm constantly amazed at how resilient the human body is. So in our 2019 study, we basically gave mouthwash for 7 days, and then we stopped for 4 days, and then brought the patients back, and then did a reevaluation, did tongue scrapings, cultured the bacteria, monitored their blood pressure. And what we found was 4 days of just stopping the mouthwash, the oral microbiome completely repopulated, their blood pressure completely normalized. So this is completely it's kind of like smoking. You know, if you stop smoking, you see the benefits almost immediately. If you stop using mouthwash, you see the benefits of that within 4 days. And that it may be sooner, but that's the first time point we looked at. But these bacteria, we have to support the microbiome. We can't destroy the microbiome. And there's no physician that would tell you to take an antibiotic every day for the rest of your life.
No.
So why would any dentist tell you to take an antiseptic mouthwash, to use fluoride to completely destroy the oral microbiome that's destroying a lot of metabolic activity and specifically nitric oxide production? So we have to get away from that. And next week I'm going to be in Chicago because we finally got the attention of the American Dental Association
Oh,
to
wonderful.
convince them to change their guidelines because dental practices in America are making people sick. We got to get rid of fluoride. You've got to stop doing root canals. You've got to stop recommending Listerine, antiseptic mouthwash. There's a better way. And what we're doing is trying to figure out how do we selectively kill the pathogenic bacteria, the ones that are known to cause cardiovascular disease, periodontal disease, gingivitis, caries, and cavities. How do we selectively kill the pathogens while supporting the non-pathogenic commensal bacteria? And that's what we've finally solved the riddle on. And so we're working on that now. We're presenting that before the American Dental Association.
Well, that's really important because we know that there is an association between periodontal disease and Alzheimer's disease because it can seep through the gums and enter the bloodstream and go up into the brain.
Yeah, well, it's the oral systemic link that's been around for 100 years. People with poor oral hygiene have higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease. So people thought, well, what is it? There's a clear observation, but what's the mechanism?
Yeah.
And people thought for years, well, it's a translocation of the bacteria. If you get bleeding gums, the pathogens enter your systemic circulation. You know, you can find these pathogens in the atheroma on patients who have died from a heart attack or stroke. So there is obviously translocation and an upregulation of LPS, cytokines, and starting the whole inflammatory cascade. But I think what we're also finding is that it's a destruction because when you have oral infections, the bad guys outcompete the good guys. So there's a dysbiosis. So it's not just mainly, it's downregulating the good nitric oxide producing bacteria. So if you can selectively kill the bad guys, the good guys then repopulate. If you can maintain good oral hygiene, the good bacteria are kind of like the cops. They keep the bad guys at bay. And so we can do this through nitric oxide. We've developed a mouth rinse, a microbiome-friendly mouth rinse. We're creating a fluoride-free toothpaste that's microbiome-friendly that restores this oral microbiome. So that alone will maybe our prebiotic or probiotic.
Okay, so you've got the oral microbiome, which is the first line of defense of like not being able to produce nitric oxide.
Well, these are two completely separate and independent nitric oxide production systems.
Okay.
One can compensate for the other.
Okay.
So if you have endothelial dysfunction, but you have a good diet, good oral microbiome, then you can overcome that deficiency that's produced in the lining of the blood vessel.
Okay.
Same thing, if you have good endothelial function, but you have a very poor diet, then you typically don't have. And I think that's why kids, who are active, good endothelial function, they can get away with eating a poor diet.
Mm-hmm.
But older people with endothelial dysfunction, if they eat a poor diet, then that's really a very slippery slope.
Accelerating
that.
Okay. So where does the standard American diet fit into the production
It's sad, right? It's the
yeah,
standard
it's a
American
sad
diet.
So where does that fit into it? And I want to know, do you subscribe to any specific diet? Like, are you a carnivore? Are you a plant-based guy?
I'm not a fan of extreme diets. I think we humans have evolved to get our nutrients from a diverse source, from plants, from animals, and different sources. But the standard American diet, if we go by, so I like to take really important clinical observations and then work back and figure out mechanism. And then you can start to develop rational therapies. So the data, and we have to look at data. The food that's grown in America today, compared to the 1940s, there's a 78% depletion of basic nutrients, micronutrients.
Complete depletion.
Things like vitamin A, vitamin D, selenium, chromium.
But even if you were to go and get organic food, right? I know that even the shelf life of spinach, if it's sitting like from the time that it's cut to when it is placed on the shelves, it loses all of its nutritional value within 3 days anyway. And we know that they're just sitting on these shelves for how long? So what are we eating then?
Well, we're eating nutrient-depleted foods.
Great.
And, going back to the days of Linus Pauling, who says that chronic disease is driven by nutrient deficiencies. So, and we published a study in 2015 showing that organically grown vegetables have less nutrients than conventionally grown. And especially the nitrate content, which is used to make nitric oxide. Because if you think about this, most Americans buy into what the media sells them. So
yes, we talk about that a lot. We always say that the healthcare industry is fed by the military-industrial complex and by these big food conglomerates and the pharmaceutical companies.
It's a beautiful financial model.
It's wonderful,
isn't it? It's at the cost of our own health.
Yeah, well, the most profitable force is illness.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's no money in curing. There's money in treating.
So that's what he's saying, guys. It basically, like, how is the media telling you to go out and eat these foods, even the food pyramid, which was debunked many years ago, which we won't even get into. But
yeah, if I wanted to make you sick, I would tell you to watch TV, follow all the guidelines, follow the government's diet, take mouthwash, take antacids, get your cholesterol below 200, and you become chronically dependent upon big pharma. So
these foods are devoid of nutrients, even organic foods, which scares me. So then in America, where are we supposed to eat from? Like, you don't live here, do you?
I live in Texas.
Oh, you live in Texas. Yeah. Okay.
So here's what I tell people is that you have to, you're almost always nutrient deficient just because of what we said. The farming practices, the pressures of feeding a growing planet, growing population are at the expense of nutrient density. So I tell people organic is good because obviously there's no herbicides or pesticides. But to get an organic label in the U.S., you can't add nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil. Right? So without nitrogen in the soil, there's no nitrate. Without nitrogen, there's no nutrient assimilation. So not only the soil is depleted in basic nutrients, but the process of nitrogen fixation in the plants to assimilate other nutrients is gone if you don't add nitrogen. So here's the solution. I live on 800 acres out in the middle of Texas. I grow my own food. I raise my own beef. But I do soil samples every year. And I test the soil. I know what's in the soil. And if there's certain nutrients that are missing, then I put that nutrient back in the soil. And then I use non-GMO seeds, and I grow those vegetables and plants in a nutrient-dense soil. I don't use herbicides or pesticides. And then you get a nutrient-dense food where there's no chemicals, no herbicides or pesticides. So that's the best way. So I tell people that live in, I'm blessed because I'm able to do that and have the resources to do that. But people who live in big cities, go to your local farmer's market, know your farmers. The pressures, consumer demand changes practice. So if you go and, what I eat is not organic because I add nitrogen to the soil. So I couldn't get an organic label on the foods that I grow on my farm.
Interesting.
But it's free of herbicides. It's free of pesticides. There's no genetically modified agents in any of these seeds that I grow. So it's just a nutrient-dense food that's free of toxic chemicals.
Interesting. I think, look, it makes sense, and actually it makes me think about the role that nitric oxide plays in not just in cellular metabolism, but more so mitochondria, because we know that we are feeding our mitochondria as well through environmental, through sunlight, through exercise, but also through what we eat.
I mean, the mitochondria are, as you know, every age-related chronic disease has mitochondrial dysfunction.
Yes.
And lower number of mitochondria per cell. So nitric oxide, again, its mechanism is very well elucidated in terms of mitochondrial function and mitochondrial biogenesis. So nitric oxide controls the electron transport chain, prevents electrons from leaking, so you get better oxygen efficiency and more ATP per cycle through the Krebs cycle if your body makes nitric oxide. The other important signaling aspects of nitric oxide is it induces mitochondrial biogenesis. So things like intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, sirtuins, all of those are dependent upon the cell's ability to produce nitric oxide. If we make nitric oxide, we activate PGC1 alpha and then mitochondrial biogenesis. So if you do intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, all these things, but the cell can't make nitric oxide, you don't get activation of PGC1 alpha and you don't get mitochondrial biogenesis. But if you restore the cell's ability to produce nitric oxide, then all these signaling pathways are intact, and intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, exercise, sirtuins, NAD, all that leads to mitochondrial biogenesis. So now the net effect is, in a person who's repleted nitric oxide, they have more mitochondria per cell, generating more cellular energy with less oxygen more efficiently. And that's optimal health.
Thank you to Apollo Neuro for sponsoring this episode. The Apollo is a therapeutic wearable designed to be worn discreetly on the wrist or ankle that works by sending gentle vibrations to the body that signal safety to the brain. It is a safe, non-invasive way to relax, get the sleep you need, focus your attention, and find your flow. I have been wearing this certain device for about 1 year. I originally got it because I really needed to downregulate my nervous system. Yes, as you can tell, I'm very high energy, very high paced. I really wanted a way to hack my system other than meditation, breath work, or even sleep per se. I really wanted to be in the driver's seat. To be honest, guys, I'm not the best meditator, which is why this device works so well. So with these soothing vibrations, Apollo directly engages with my body's nervous system, and these vibrations help to naturally regulate stress responses and promote a state of calm, enhancing my ability to manage daily stresses without reliance on pharmaceutical aids. So if you want to be in the driver's seat, if you meditate and do breath work to calm your nervous system down, and you don't want to do that alone because you know that that alone is not as powerful as a device like Apollo, you can grab one of these. You can get $40 off any of the Apollo wearable devices by visiting the link in the description below, or simply going to apolloneuro.com and use code NEURO40. That is apolloneuro.com with code NEURO40 to receive $40 off.
That's a beautiful process. But basically what you're saying is you can go out and do all the good things, live like a monk, if you will, but if you have an inability to restore and produce nitric oxide, then all of that doesn't really matter to an extent.
No, it doesn't. I mean, look, I was on the doctor show a couple of years ago. We first revealed that if you use mouthwash and you go and do exercise, you lose the protective benefits of exercise. So think about this in the context of the average American who's health conscious, who wants to eat a good diet, plant-based diet, exercise every day. But if they're using mouthwash or have fluoride in their toothpaste that kills the microbiome, they lose the protective benefits of the diet and the exercise program. I mean, it's amazing.
So you're saying that if you're a marathoner, but you are having mouthwash, then you're getting no benefits from doing those.
It's compromising your performance. And it's not just athletic performance, it's sexual performance, it's cognitive performance, it's performance as we know it.
What do you think about this whole controversial topic about nitrates in foods such as salami, bacon, etc.? Because I think that this is, we have to talk about this because cured meats are getting like a really bad rap. And look, rightfully so in some in some instincts, but it's, I'm Greek. There's a lot of meat in my culture.
Yeah.
And it really upsets me when I hear things like that. So what's the truth behind it?
The truth is, this may be shocking, we've been misinformed.
Oh, what?
Yeah. So this started back in the 50s. And again, I think most scientific observations and programs have good intent, right? So again, you start with important clinical observations, and then you work back and try to figure out mechanism. What is it that's happening with an association between two things or multiple things that lead to chronic disease or some disease outcome? So in the 1950s, it was first observed that nitrite-cured meats, and this was in fish, this was a 1956 paper, that you could have preformed nitrosamines. And this was specifically N-nitrosyl dimethylamine, which is a potent carcinogen and mutagenic compound that causes cancer, primarily liver cancers. And then the nutritional epidemiologists came in the 70s and 80s and started to correlate meat eaters, cured and processed meats, with a slight increase, what they call a relative risk in certain cancers, primarily gastroesophageal cancers. So maybe a relative risk of, say, 1.18, 18%. So anything below a relative risk of 2 is typically just noise. Anything above 2, it's probably a real effect. So then they go back to the 1950s and go, nitrite-cured meats can form nitrosamines. Nitrosamines cause cancer. So then there's your biologically plausible mechanism of nitrate and nitrite and cured and processed meats, increased risk of certain cancers. But what they failed to recognize in the 1980s, it was starting to be realized that nitrate and nitrite are actually naturally produced in the human body. That's what led to the discovery of nitric oxide. When you activate an immune response, you see an increased production of nitrite and nitrate in the human body. And then you work backwards and figure out, nitric oxide is the intermediate. So now that is completely elucidated. And if that were true, let's just say nitrite and nitrate in cured and processed meats cause cancer. We bought into it. The media's told us this. If that were the case, vegetarians would have a 10-time higher rate of cancer than meat eaters. Because 85% of the nitrate and nitrite we get from our diet comes from plants and vegetables. Only 5% comes from cured and processed meats. The other 10% comes from swallowing our own saliva from the nitrite and nitrate that are naturally produced in the human body. And we know it's just the opposite. That people who practice a plant-based diet have lower incidence of cancers. So the numbers don't work, and their whole hypothesis falls apart. And I published a book on this. It's called Nitrite and Nitrate in Human Health and Disease, and we're on our second edition, but I co-edited this with Joe Lascalzo, who's a cardiologist at Harvard. He's chair of medicine at Harvard and chief of cardiology at the Brigham in Boston. But we actually invited Walt Willett, who's probably the nutritional epidemiologist at Harvard, and he basically kind of somewhat admitted that they got it wrong. So he doesn't dispute the increased, and association is not causation. And people who eat a certain amount of cured and processed meats have a certain higher incidence of certain gastroesophageal cancers, for example. But there's so many confounders out there that their biologically plausible mechanism falls apart. It's not the nitrite and the nitrate in the cured and processed meats that's doing that. And we published this in 2009. And people spend a lot of money on no nitrite cured bacon.
I was going to say, is it worth it? Yeah.
No, you're spending way more money. And we published that the no nitrite added bacon has 3 to 4 times more nitrite than the nitrite cured bacon.
How is that possible?
Well, because the meat companies, again, giving in to the consumer demands and the misinformation, tried to figure out, how do we not add nitrite to cured meat? And the answer was, there's no way you can't, because then you would have an epidemic of foodborne illnesses, botulism, salmonella, because this prevents food spoilage and prevents bacterial overgrowth. So what they've done, this is creative marketing, is they take celery powder, which is enriched in nitrate. So they're adding a cultured celery powder to the meat, and then they're adding a bacterial culture called Staph carnosus, which is a nitrate reducer. So these bacteria are reducing nitrate to nitrite. It's the nitrite that cures the meat. So because they're not adding sodium nitrite or potassium nitrite directly to the meat product, they can say no nitrite added. But they have to add it, or else it wouldn't be a cured meat product, and it would have a shelf life of less than a day, and people would get sick from eating it.
So then how do you correlate the increase of these cured meats and gastroesophageal cancer then?
Well, there's so many other confounders. People who eat a lot of cured and processed meats have other habits.
Yeah.
They may be smokers. They may be
They
sedentary.
never state that, do they? They
No,
never.
I mean, you try to account for the confounders, but
Yeah.
there's no way in nutritional epidemiology
No.
you can account for all the confounders in a cohort of 1,000 people.
Oh gosh.
And then here's the other deal. It's a statistical illusion, the absolute risk versus the relative risk.
Yeah.
And the thing you need to understand in drug trials and in nutritional epidemiology is the number to treat,
Yes. NNT.
right? And so it's a
NTT,
statistical
sorry.
sleight of hand when you
Yes.
look at relative risk. So relative risk to me are absolutely meaningless, but that's what makes the headlines. 100% increase in
course.
your risk of getting cancers if you do this. But what if you look at the real data? So and let's put this in perspective. If we had 10,000 people in a control group and 10,000 people in a placebo group or a treatment group, and let's just say in the control group, 1 out of those people got stomach cancer, 1 out of 10,000. And then in the other group, where we're primarily of meat eaters or bacon eaters or cured meat eaters, 2 out of 10,000
Oh yes.
got cancer. So the headlines in that study is a doubling of risk.
Doubling. Yes.
100% increase in risk if you eat cured meat cancer. But it was actually 1 out of, so the number to see that in a general population, it's meaningless.
I think it's also important to understand that the dose makes the poison. You
Absolutely.
know, it's like people just. I am so happy I'm not in the nutrition space. I don't touch it, especially on social media. I do not go near the space because it's not my field. I like when people stick to their lanes. My lane is Alzheimer's. I understand there is a nutritional component. That's not my area of study. Mine is exercise for mild cognitive impairment. So I stick to that.
Yeah.
But what I hate so much is everyone talking about the harmful effects of sucralose, all these. It's like the dose makes the poison. And we're failing to see that. And everyone's like, well, Diet Coke is going to kill you. It's like, if you have 1 can a month, I don't think it's going to kill you. Even 1 can a day. I think you have to have 50, 150 a day for it to have a little bit of an effect.
Yeah, it's the chronic exposure. What I tell people all the time, what you do 1 day a week is going to kill you. It's what you do the other 6 days.
Correct.
It's going to get you. Right. And so again, it goes back to nitric oxide is extremely important. It's critical. But what I've found in 25 years of studying the human body is that chronic disease is caused by only 2 things. Your body's missing something that it needs, or it's exposed to something that it doesn't need. So if you remove the body from toxins it's exposed to and replete missing nutrients, then the body's regenerative by nature. We just got to get out of the way. The problem is we get in the way of the body.
Well, so far, we've got nutrition, we've got oral microbiome that's disrupting it. What else is disrupting it? Our ability to make it.
Yeah, the big one is antacids.
Oh,
The proton pump inhibitors specifically.
yes.
So those drugs have been on the market now for probably since the 80s, I think. And these drugs are used to stop the production of stomach acid for gastroesophageal reflux disease. And when the FDA approved these drugs, there were no long-term safety studies.
Of course.
The clinical trials were only, 3 to 5 days at most, maybe a month use to stop stomach acid secretion, prevent gastroesophageal reflux disease, and then Barrett's esophagus and all that. Now that these drugs have been on the market for decades, we're finding in 2015 the first, again, an important clinical observation. People who had been on PPIs for 3 to 5 years, 40% higher incidence of heart attack and stroke. And then last December, a paper came out that people, and this is relevant for you, people who had been on proton pump inhibitors for at least 3 years had a 40% higher incidence of Alzheimer's. So again, you start with these observations. Now, what's responsible for that? Now, mechanistically, these proton pump inhibitors they completely shut down the body's ability to make nitric oxide from both pathways. So this one drug shuts down nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessel and the nitric oxide produced from the oral bacteria from swallowing our own saliva. And so what's the consequence of that? 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's. So we have to get people off of proton pump inhibitors and antacids. 200 million prescriptions written every year. And
Don't
now you
people
can
just
buy
take
these
it
over the
naturally,
counter.
like you can buy it over the counter. I see people taking these just standard, like, oh, I'm going to go out, I'm going to eat horribly, so I'm going to take an antacid just in case.
Yeah, and if you look at the warnings on this, so they're causing hip fractures. They're causing kidney disease. So if you read, and nobody does this, but if you read the package insert on these, nobody would take these drugs. Because for me, it's all about risk benefit. What's the benefit? I mean, maybe alleviation of heartburn. What's the risk? Well, you're going to die from heart attack, stroke, you're going to get Alzheimer's, you're going to have hip fractures. Without stomach acid, you can't absorb iodine, you can't absorb B vitamins, you can't absorb iron, you can't absorb calcium. What does that mean? You get brittle bones and you bone loss. And so there's the risk of these drugs way far outweigh any benefit. And, I'm an advocate for these drugs should be taken off the market. They're dangerous. They're killing people. It's leading to chronic disease. And the FDA and these drug manufacturers have to take responsibility and do what's right for the American public and take these drugs off the market. They provide no benefit and they're killing people.
To be honest, who's going out there and taking copious amounts of antacids?
Everybody.
See, I'm so segregated. I'm in my world. Sometimes it's still hard for me to believe. Like when I see somebody with a cigarette, I think, oh my God, like it actually shocks me when I hear that people just don't exercise. Exercise is part of my hygiene. When I hear that people are like, oh yeah, no, I went for a run like a month ago. It's so out of my world. So when you tell me that people are taking them habitually, I think to myself, what? It's so shocking.
You don't even have to have a prescription for them anymore. These are outside the care of a physician, and you can go to your grocery store, health food store, and you can buy these, and people take them every day. And they've been taking them. I know people have been taking them for 10, 15, 20 years. Multiple strokes, and they wonder why they're sick.
I wonder what the hormonal component would be to nitric oxide, because this whole time I've been thinking about erectile dysfunction and lack of oxygen. But we know that even, as I mentioned, and right now I'm actually publishing, I've probably said the word menopause so many times because I'm currently looking at postmenopausal women and Alzheimer's disease and estrogen receptors, etc. And we also know that we get a decline in testosterone, males do, as we get older. So, and we know that there is erectile dysfunction just due to aging in that population, but also the postmenopausal women, we know that there is erectile dysfunction there. Sexual dysfunction, I should say. So is there a hormonal component with?
Absolutely. So nitric oxide is part of the secretory process of endocrine glands. Even, estrogen secretion, testosterone secretion from the gonads. And then it's a two-way street. And then estrogen and testosterone can activate and stimulate nitric oxide production. And that's why premenopausal women are protected from heart attack and stroke because of the positive activation and regulation of nitric oxide by estrogen. So at menopause, you lose estrogen, you lose the activation of nitric oxide, and you see the risk of heart attack and stroke in postmenopausal women, just go through the roof.
Yes.
So what I tell people in a lot of these hormone clinics that are doing hormone replacement therapy is you can replete and restore estrogen or testosterone or hormones, but first let's focus on restoring the enzymatic production of nitric oxide, because if you restore the hormones without restoring the enzymatic function of nitric oxide, you're not going to restore the cardioprotective benefits of hormone replacement therapy. So nitric oxide is absolutely critical and essential in hormone replacement therapy. In fact, in 2007, we published that nitric oxide is actually a hormone. So similar to hormone replacement therapy for estrogen, thyroid, testosterone, we have to restore the nitric oxide hormone. And we have to do that through giving the actual gas, the actual molecule, not giving your body precursors and substrates. And you don't take... we don't give precursors in hormone replacement therapy. We give bioidentical hormones, or we give the actual molecule. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do with nitric oxide. We give the actual molecule.
So you've probably got a huge distaste in the Women's Health Initiative study as well.
Oh, it was tragedy.
Yes, the worst thing to happen in female health, but we won't even go there because we've only got, 20 minutes left. But I really want to now focus on what you're doing, what your company is doing, because you actually gave me, you gifted me some dissolvable
Yes.
Is that so? So tell me what that is, because I don't think I have a problem producing nitric. I don't know. I feel like I've got a lot of blood flow. I consider myself healthy. I don't drink, smoke. I exercise daily. I feel like I've got adequate, but you never know.
You never know.
We can't test it. One day, I always say that it's my dream to be able to have a continuous blood pressure monitor. Hopefully one day we'll get one of those, but maybe one day we'll be able to test nitric oxide very.
Yeah, it's coming.
It's coming.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Stay
So
tuned.
what happens then? I'm going to take this dissolvable pill. It's a lozenge.
Yeah.
Right?
It's an orally disintegrating tablet.
And what's that going to do for me?
Well, first, I mean, so I tell people ask me all the time, is there a need to monitor? And I go, well, there's only 2 people in the world who need nitric oxide. There's people who are sick and want to get well. There's people who are well and don't want to get sick. So do you need to test? I mean, if you're one of those 2 people, then you should take it. Mm-hmm. So what we do is nitric oxide's a gas, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you capture the therapeutic potential of nitric oxide gas? And so my claim to fame is I'm the only person who's made a solid dose form of bioactive gas. It's nitric oxide. So we had to make this in a matrix that falls apart, that has a certain dissolution rate. So when you put it in your mouth, it's activated by your saliva. This matrix falls apart, and we generate about 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas. We can quantify it, we can detect it, we can verify that it's coming off. And we can show its work. We can use an ultrasound on the carotid. We can see dilation of the carotids within about 10 to 15 seconds.
No.
So the nitric oxide that's being produced in the mouth goes systemic. It binds to cysteine thiols, to glutathione. It's transported. It's vasoactive. So we can see that we're delivering this hormone. So it's just like testosterone or estrogen. Fortunately, when we do hormone replacement therapy for testosterone, we don't have to give injections in the gonads, right? We can do intramuscular. We can do sublingual troches. We can do creams. And same thing with nitric oxide. We don't have to reproduce this in the lining of the blood vessels. We can produce it in the oral cavity, which, by the way, we recouple the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. So we're improving endothelial function, and we're restoring the good oral bacteria. So that lozenge really gets to the root cause. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, we do it for you, and we improve the body's ability to make it on its own.
So even if I don't have a problem, once I have it, there can be no harmful effects. Unless you can't overdose.
Well, you can. I mean, dose dictates poison.
Correct.
Right? So the toxicities we're concerned with nitric oxide are an unsafe drop in blood pressure, and then methemoglobinemia, which means that it oxidizes the heme iron of hemoglobin and reduces the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. But no, if you take these and look, I turned 50 in November, and I don't have a nitric oxide problem, but I've been taking this for 20 years. And I take it not because I need it, because I don't want to need it.
Correct.
Right? We have to be proactive instead of reactive. I don't want to wait until I get ED or high blood pressure, have a heart attack to go, oh, you know what? I need nitric oxide. No, let's focus on that now. Let's be proactive. Take your daily nitric oxide, like you take a daily vitamin C or vitamin D, and prevent that age-related loss. And so those are our consumer products, but we're taking that technology and we now have going through the FDA to get these drugs approved on the market so physicians can prescribe it to their patients. It's safe. We've demonstrated safety. We've got drugs for ischemic heart disease. We've got a drug for Alzheimer's, as we mentioned, and then I make a topical drug for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. And that's going to be a game changer, I think. And there's been no innovations in wound care for the past 50, 60 years.
No.
And nitric oxide kills the infection in the non-healing wound. And wounds are non-healing because there's no blood flow, right? There's hypoxia and ischemia to that wounds. So nitric oxide dilates the blood vessels, causes a hyperemic response, kills the infection, and wounds heal. It's remarkable technology.
So that would be a topical.
It'd be a topical drug, yeah.
Drug. Wow, that's and then when you take it, I mean, I guess this is why we've seen a rise in, isn't arginine in almost every pre-workout?
Yeah,
because when I take it, like I don't take it, but like when I have, my skin gets itchy because I feel like there's all this blood flow.
Well, it's not. It's actually, it's compromising blood flow because you're never limiting an L-arginine. It's a semi-essential amino acid. You get it from the proteins you eat, and it's made through the urea cycle. And giving excess arginine actually leads to an upregulation of arginase, and you basically dispose of it as urea, and you divert it away from nitric oxide production. And there's 2 clinical trials where they gave high-dose arginine to post-infarct patients and to patients with peripheral artery disease, and they got worse.
Mm-hmm.
So L-arginine should not be used in anybody. You don't need it, especially if you have endothelial dysfunction.
So then taking one of these lozenges you could take as a pre-workout, if you will.
Yeah, we make a fermented beet powder called NO Beets that's our pre-workout, because beets kind of give us and we make a fermented beet powder. We remove the oxalates and the beet pulp so it doesn't look or taste like beets, but as soon as you put this in solution in water, it's meant to be taken as a shot. And now we're generating nitric oxide systemically, and it's an unbelievable pre-workout energy product.
Where were you 15 years ago when I was a competitive triathlete? I raced for Australia, and my coach used to always say to me, before you go out on a race, I want you to have beetroot juice. I was like, what? Yuck. Well, and I was drinking it. I was.
And all the gastric distress.
I don't know what. It was a bloodbath in there. But that was, and I never understood why I needed to have beetroot juice.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, most beetroot products on the market don't do anything but turn your pee and your poop red. There's no nitric oxide to it. That company's selling gummies and chews with beets, and it's probably the biggest fraud out there. Gummies and chews are completely useless. You can't generate nitric oxide in gummies or chews. So, we're trying to, steer the ship in the right direction in the nitric oxide field and bring to market products that actually work, because there's a lot of deceptive marketing and fraudulent products out there that are, people are taking and hope that they get nitric oxide from it. But, there's no way mechanistically these products generate nitric oxide.
Well, you've changed my life. Yeah, I think. So what's new for you now what's on the horizons?
I've got a new book coming out probably this fall, early winter, called The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing Nitric Oxide to Life, where we really talk about the discovery of nitric oxide, and it's part autobiographical. It talks about the discoveries we made over the past 20 years, how we've been able to translate that into product technology, the hurdles we had to overcome, the disruption in the space, the attacks we've had to overcome, because what we're doing is disruptive.
You mean disruptive to the U.S. healthcare system?
And big pharma, and to competitive companies out there who try to come after me and, stop us doing what we're doing.
There's other competitors in your space?
Oh, yeah. I'm involved in multiple lawsuits. People come after me and sue. We're a target. But, I wear that as a badge of courage, because if you're doing things that are trivial and meaningless, people leave you alone. If you're doing things that are meaningful, that are revolutionary, then you become a target. So I wear it as a badge of courage, and we're going to fight them, and we're going to win. But yeah, I'm most excited about our drug discovery program. We've got drugs now in phase 3 clinical trials for ischemic heart disease, where hopefully next year we'll have our clinical trial designed and completed for our Alzheimer's drug study. And so I think, as we get these early drugs approved, then we'll move for other indications, because I'm truly convinced that there's not a single disease process where nitric oxide at the right dose, at the right time, in the right patient wouldn't provide benefit.
At the right time.
That's right. So to treat Alzheimer's disease may be different than treating a patient with ischemic heart disease or diabetes. There's a progression of disease that you may have to intervene at certain times at different doses to affect that disease process.
I think we could do an entire episode just on nitric oxide and Alzheimer's disease, because I'm still trying to understand that if you are in late stage, let's just say, I don't know if you're going to test this eventually, but we've got evidently a buildup of tau and amyloid deposition. Is it going to be clearing those out, or is it just going to be able to provide more adequate blood flow? Because even with adequate blood flow, you still wouldn't ameliorate the plaques.
No, look, if you support the cellular function and autophagy, you basically get rid of the cellular debris, the misfolded proteins, and you excrete it. And if we provide adequate blood supply, oxygen, and nutrients, and then maintain normal cellular function, then that cell can function, that tissue can function, that organ can function. So I think it's completely reversible. Although I think in every disease process, there's probably a point where it's past the point of no return. In people who have severe advanced Alzheimer's,
which is only detectable with a CSF.
Yeah. Are we going to be able to regress those? Maybe not. But I think what we can do, and what I feel confident is, if we can detect this early enough in the process, I'm 100% confident that we can slow the progression and at best reverse disease.
Tim, I know I'm all over the shop, but I just keep thinking, what would be the is there anything for women who are maybe experiencing unexplained infertility and nitric oxide?
Yeah, again, I think it's that's
Female
multifactorial.
specifically, yes.
Yeah. So number one, I'm finding that it's usually hypothyroidism, and that's usually due to an iodine deficiency and overexposure to fluoride. Because if you remember from the periodic table, these are halogens.
Yes.
Most people are deficient in iodine, but yet we're chronically exposed to fluoride. So you need iodine to convert T4 to T3, which is the active enzyme. You got to balance your hormones. But for conception, the egg and the sperm have to meet. So in men, nitric oxide is what controls sperm motility. So without nitric oxide, there's little sperm motility and there's no conception. In women, obviously, it's hormone regulation. It's normalizing your thyroid. It's eliminating from the body the toxins, and then giving good nutrition. And then, I'm still, I think childbirth and conception is still a miraculous process. I mean, we understand kind of scientifically, but to me, it's still a miracle.
Wow. Well, I am so excited to follow your research avidly. I'm excited for your book. Please let us know when that comes out. I'm going to be aggressively watching your Alzheimer's disease trials, and I hope that we can do a part 2 when the book comes out.
Let's do it.
Yeah, we're going to need another 2 to 3 hours. But thank you so much for coming onto the Neuro Experience podcast.